This is a story about a man who was sentenced to 4 years in prison for criticizing China's president. This might sound like a crazy story from a country like North Korea or Turkmenistan, but it happened in 2021 in the United States. The man was not an outspoken activist or journalist. He was just a regular guy who made some jokes about President Xi Jinping on Facebook. He didn't even make the post from within China. He was halfway across the world in America. But the Chinese government still managed to get their hands on him and bring him to justice. But why did they go through all this trouble? What kind of power do they have over someone living all the way in America? And how did a simple Facebook post end up costing this man so dearly? To understand this, we need to take a look at the kind of freedom of speech that exists in China. You might think there's no freedom of speech in China, and you wouldn't be completely wrong. If you're a Chinese citizen, you're probably aware of the government's tight control over media and the internet. It's nearly impossible to talk about certain topics like the Tiananmen Square protests or the Uyghurs without getting on the government's bad side. And the Great Firewall of China blocks access to many foreign websites like Google, Twitter, and YouTube. But things aren't as clear-cut when it comes to ordinary Chinese people talking about politics online. The Chinese government doesn't block discussion of politics per se. It's more that they want to encourage certain conversations while discouraging others. For example, you can talk about changing the president. In fact, the government actively encourages it. When it's time for the Communist Party's 5-year-long election, every eligible voter is expected to show up and vote yes on whatever candidate the party puts forward. Not showing up to vote is a serious offense because it shows a lack of patriotism and could get you into trouble with the authorities. Similarly, if you don't vote yes, you're also causing trouble by going against the party. But if you vote no, you won't face any consequences. It's just that nobody dares to do it. Now, this is an extreme example, but it shows that the Chinese government isn't trying to prevent political conversations. They just want to make sure that the conversation goes in a direction that benefits them. The Chinese government has been trying to shape public opinion since the early days of the People's Republic. Back in 1949, Mao Zedong introduced a system called the Mass Line, which aimed to connect the Communist Party to the people. This involved mobilizing large groups of people around political goals and encouraging them to give feedback to the party. The government used posters, newspapers, and pamphlets to collect opinions from the masses. But this wasn't always effective. Sometimes people weren't honest in their feedback or the government simply ignored it. In the 1980s, the Chinese government tried a new approach called the primary stage, which focused on gathering opinions from ordinary people in small groups. This approach worked better, but it was still time-consuming and expensive. Then, in the late 1990s, the Chinese government embraced the internet as a way to collect public opinion. They created a network of websites and chat rooms where people could discuss politics and social issues. The government also invested heavily in censoring these platforms and blocking access to any content that could be deemed harmful to the country. This allowed the government to keep tabs on what people were saying and shut down any potential threats before they became too big. Today, the Chinese government continues to use the internet to gather public opinion. They monitor social media platforms like Weibo and WeChat for any signs of dissent or criticism of the government. If they find anything, they may delete the post, ban the user, or even arrest them. But despite all these efforts, the Chinese government still hasn't been able to completely control the narrative. There are still plenty of people in China who criticize the government and its policies, often at great personal risk. One recent example is the case of Wu Qiaowei, a retired professor who was arrested in 2019 for posting critical essays on his blog. Another one is the case of Liu Xia, a poet who was sentenced to 4 years in prison for posting a picture of a bloodied Tiananmen Square. These cases are relatively rare, though. Most people in China are afraid of speaking out against the government, because they know that they could be arrested and put on trial for crimes like subversion or inciting trouble. The Chinese government's tight control over the media and the internet has been compared to a virtual dictatorship. Despite this, though, the Chinese people still have a few ways to express themselves and hold the government accountable. One way is through the courts. Although the Chinese court system is heavily influenced by the Communist Party, it is still possible to bring a case to court if you have enough evidence. For example, in 2017, a group of villagers won a landmark case against their local government that had seized their land for development. Another way to hold the government accountable is through the media. Although most Chinese media outlets are controlled by the Communist Party, there are still a few independent outlets that operate outside of the country. For example, the Hong Kong-based China Watch is known for its investigative reporting on corruption and human rights abuses in China. Finally, the Chinese people also have each other. By sharing information and experiences, the Chinese people are able to keep each other informed about the government's activities and hold each other accountable. For example, the #MeToo movement has gained traction in China despite the government's efforts to silence it. By sharing their stories, Chinese women are raising awareness about sexual harassment and holding their abusers accountable. But the Chinese government is always looking for ways to crack down on dissent and keep the population under control. They've recently been targeting activists and journalists who use the internet to criticize the government. For example, in 2021, the Chinese government detained 2 journalists who published an investigation into the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. Similarly, in 2020, they arrested 4 activists who plan to run in the primary elections for the US presidency. These arrests send a message to the rest of the population that the government is willing to go to extreme lengths to silence critics. Despite the risks, though, many Chinese people continue to speak out against the government. They use social media platforms like Weibo and WeChat to share information and hold the government accountable. They also organize protests and demonstrations, although these are often met with brutal crackdowns. Despite all the challenges, the Chinese people are not giving up the fight for freedom of speech. They know that it is essential to a free and open society, and they are willing to put their own safety on the line to protect it. Wang Jingyu was a man who lived in New York City and worked as a manager at a Chinese restaurant. He was a quiet and unassuming man who kept to himself. But behind closed doors he had a wild side. He loved to party and let loose. And he would often stay out late drinking with his friends. One night, Wang was drinking with his friends at a bar in Manhattan. They were celebrating the birthday of one of their friends, and the mood was festive. As the night wore on, the group started to get drunk, and the conversation turned to politics. Wang had never been much of a political person, but he found himself getting drawn into the conversation. His friends were talking about the recent crackdown on protesters in Hong Kong, and Wang couldn't help but feel outraged. He knew that he wasn't in danger of being arrested and sent to jail, so he started to voice his opinion. He talked about how the Chinese government was oppressing the people of Hong Kong and how he wished they would just back off. His friends listened patiently to him, but they were starting to get bored of the conversation. So they tried to change the subject, but Wang wasn't having it. He continued to rant about the Chinese government, and soon he was shouting at the top of his lungs. At that point, his friends decided that they had had enough. They told Wang to calm down and stop making a scene, but he refused. He kept shouting until the bartender came over and kicked him out of the bar. Wang was furious, but he knew that he had taken things too far. He decided that he needed to calm down and take a walk. He stepped out onto the sidewalk and started to stroll down the street. As he walked, he looked around him at the city of New York. He realized how lucky he was to be living in a country where he could speak his mind. He knew that if he had done the same thing in China, he would have been arrested and sent to jail. Just then, Wang saw a Starbucks and decided to go inside and get a cup of coffee. He ordered a mocha and sat down at a table to wait for it. As he sipped on his coffee, he thought about what he had done. He knew that he shouldn't have been so rude to his friends, but he couldn't help himself. He felt too strongly about the situation in Hong Kong. Suddenly, Wang heard a commotion outside. He looked out the window and saw a group of men arguing with a woman. The men were Chinese and the woman was a reporter from the New York Times. She was trying to interview them about their trip to the US, but they didn't want to talk to her. Instead, they started yelling at her and calling her a spy. Wang felt angry. He knew that these men were just like the Chinese government. They were trying to silence the truth. Without thinking, Wang got up from his table and walked out of the Starbucks. He approached the group of men and started yelling at them in Mandarin. He told them that they were cowards and that they should be ashamed of themselves. The men were taken aback by Wang's outburst. They had expected the Americans to support them, not yell at them. They tried to argue with Wang, but he wouldn't have it. He kept yelling at them until they eventually walked away. The whole incident left Wang feeling tired and drained. He had never been so angry in his life. He knew that he couldn't keep living like this. He needed to find a way to control his temper, but at that moment, he felt proud. He had stood up for what he believed in and silenced the voices of oppression. Little did he know that his actions would soon come back to haunt him. A few weeks later, Wang was going through his usual morning routine. He was making breakfast and checking his phone while watching TV. Suddenly, his phone started buzzing. He looked at the screen and saw a message from an unknown number. It read, "We know what you did." Wang was confused and scared. He tried to call back the number, but it was blocked. He decided to ignore the message and hope that it was just a prank. But the next day, Wang received another message. It read, "You can't hide." This time Wang was scared. He didn't know who was sending him these messages, but he was starting to get worried. He tried to shake off the feeling and went about his day. But the messages kept coming. Every day, Wang would wake up to a new message from the unknown number. They were always cryptic and vague, but they were making Wang paranoid. He started to feel like he was being watched, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen. One day, Wang decided that he had had enough. He called the police and told them about the messages he had been receiving. The officers were polite, but they told Wang that they couldn't do anything unless he had evidence of a crime. They advised him to just ignore the messages and move on. But Wang couldn't do that. He was too scared. He decided to hire a private investigator to follow him and see if he could find out who was behind the messages. The investigator told Wang that he would get back to him in a few days. But in the meantime, he should keep doing his normal routine and not draw any attention to himself. A few days later, the investigator met with Wang and told him that he had good news and bad news. The bad news was that he hadn't been able to find out who was behind the messages. The good news was that he had discovered something else. He had noticed a black car following Wang for several days, and he had gotten license plate numbers. The car was registered to a company in California, and the investigator had already contacted the authorities there to see if they could trace the owner. Wang was relieved to hear this, but he was still worried about the messages. He asked the investigator to keep following him and to let him know if he noticed anything else unusual. As the days passed, Wang started to feel like he was losing his mind. The messages were driving him crazy, and he couldn't focus on anything else. Then one day, everything changed. The investigator called Wang and told him that he had found out who was behind the messages. It was a group of Chinese businessmen who had seen Wang's confrontation with the reporters. They had hired a private investigator to find out who he was, and they had been sending him the messages to scare him off. Wang was relieved to hear this, but he was also angry. He couldn't believe that these businessmen had tried to intimidate him and make him afraid to speak his mind. He decided that he wasn't going to let them win. He was going to continue speaking out against the Chinese government and telling the truth no matter what they did. From that day on, Wang Jingyu became known as the Chinese Robin Hood for his daring acts of stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. He organized protests against the Chinese government and helped those who had been oppressed by the regime. He became a symbol of hope and resistance for the Chinese people, and his legacy continues to inspire people today. Thank you for watching this video. We hope that you enjoyed it and learned something new. If you did, please leave us a like and subscribe so that you don't miss any of our future videos.